She stood at the edge of the property line, staring at what $2,000 had bought her a collapsing cabin that looked more haunted than habitable. But when the floorboards gave way beneath her feet that first day, revealing a hidden chamber filled with something impossible, everything she thought she knew about reality shattered. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. Madison Hayes had always been the practical one in her family. At 32, she owned a modest apartment in Portland, worked as an accountant for a sustainable energy firm, and kept her life organized in color-coded spreadsheets. Her friends joked that she planned her spontaneity 2 weeks in advance, which is why nobody understood her decision to buy an abandoned cabin sight unseen from a tax auction website at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The listing had been sparse: mountain property with structure, as, no warranty, $2,000 minimum bid. One grainy photo showed a cabin barely visible through overgrown vegetation. Located 3 hours from Portland in the Cascade foothills, the property had been abandoned for over 20 years according to county records. No other bidders competed for it. "You bought what?" Her best friend Sarah nearly choked on her coffee when Madison told her the next morning. "Have you lost your mind? You don't even camp." Madison couldn't explain the compulsion that had driven her to enter her credit card information and click Confirm Purchase. Something about that lone photograph had called to her a whisper of possibility in her rigidly controlled life. "I need a project," she said weakly. "Something different. Different would be taking up pottery or dating that guy from your hiking group. This is insane." But the deed was done. Madison now owned 5 acres of Washington wilderness, and whatever remained of the cabin built in 1952, according to the sparse records. The previous owner, listed as E. Whitmore, had died in 2001 with no heirs. The property had languished in legal limbo until the county finally foreclosed for unpaid taxes. 3 weeks later, on a drizzly October morning, Madison drove her practical Honda Civic up increasingly rough roads toward her impulsive purchase. The GPS gave up 2 miles from the destination, leaving her to navigate by hand-drawn directions from the county clerk's office. The road deteriorated from paved to gravel to barely more than parallel ruts carved through the forest. She almost missed the rusted mailbox, marking the driveway if the overgrown track deserved that name. Tree branches scraped her car's sides as she inched forward, wincing at each contact. After a quarter mile that felt like 10, the trees suddenly opened into a clearing. Madison's first thought was that she'd been scammed. The cabin looked like a strong wind might finish what time and weather had started. The roof sagged dramatically in the middle, cedar shingles green with moss. Windows were either broken or boarded over. The front porch had detached from the main structure, tilting at a drunken angle. Blackberry vines engulfed one entire side, their thorny embrace slowly pulling the walls apart. She sat in her car for several minutes, engine running, debating whether to reverse down that terrible driveway and pretend this never happened. Sarah would never let her live it down, but better embarrassment than whatever this was. Then she noticed something odd. Despite the cabin's decrepit state, the stone chimney stood perfectly straight, its mortar joints intact, and the foundation, what she could see of it, appeared solid. Grabbing her backpack of supplies, flashlight, first aid kit, water, protein bars, and the bear spray, Sarah had insisted on, Madison stepped out into the damp mountain air. It smelled of pine, wet earth, and something else. Something almost metallic. The silence was profound, broken only by distant bird calls and the whisper of wind through evergreen boughs. The front steps creaked ominously under her weight. The door hung askew on one hinge, revealing glimpses of a dim interior. Madison pushed it open carefully, half expecting bats or worse to come flying out. Instead, she faced a remarkably intact main room. Dust motes danced in shafts of light filtering through gaps in the roof. And stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel carved with intricate patterns. Built-in bookshelves flanked the fireplace, empty but still sturdy. The furniture had long since rotted or been removed, leaving only a few broken chair legs and what might have been a table. Rodent droppings littered the floor, and cobwebs draped every corner like Halloween decorations. But the bones of the place, the actual structure, seemed surprisingly sound for a building abandoned 2 decades. Madison moved carefully across the main room, testing each floorboard before putting her full weight on it. The kitchen area was a disaster, cabinets hanging by single screws, sink basin cracked and filled with forest debris, appliances long gone. But again, the basic framework remained intact. A narrow staircase led to what must be a loft bedroom. Madison tested the first step gingerly. It held. She climbed slowly, flashlight beam dancing ahead. The loft was smaller than expected, barely 6 feet at the peak. A broken bed frame occupied most of the space. Water damage had destroyed much of the ceiling, leaving gaps that showed sky. Returning downstairs, Madison noticed a door she'd initially missed, painted the same faded gray as the walls. It led to what had probably been a pantry or storage room. Empty shelves lined the walls. The floor here felt different, hollow somehow. She bounced experimentally, definitely hollow. Using her phone's flashlight for better visibility, Madison knelt and examined the floorboards. They were newer than those in the main room, probably added during a renovation. One board had warped, creating a gap. She worked her fingers into the space and pulled. The board came up easily, too easily. It hadn't been nailed down, just fitted into place. Beneath was darkness. Madison aimed her flashlight into the gap, revealing a ladder descending into what looked like a root cellar. But root cellars were typically accessed from outside, and this ladder was metal, not wood, modern, not historic. Her practical mind screamed warnings about structural integrity, dangerous gases, and the foolishness of exploring alone. But that same compulsion that had driven her to buy this place pushed her forward. She removed 3 more boards, creating an opening large enough to climb through. The ladder felt solid, recently installed based on the lack of rust. Madison descended carefully, testing each rung. The temperature dropped noticeably as she went down at least 15 degrees cooler. Her feet touched a concrete floor after about 10 feet. Madison played her flashlight around the space and gasped. This wasn't a root cellar. It was a room, finished with drywall and containing modern electrical outlets. Fluorescent fixtures hung from the ceiling, their bulbs dark. Metal shelving units lined the walls, empty but clean. No dust, no cobwebs, no signs of abandonment. In the room's center sat a table steel, industrial-looking, with a locked drawer. Madison approached cautiously. The table's surface was etched with symbols she didn't recognize. Geometric patterns interwoven with what might be mathematical equations or could be decorative designs. Her flashlight beam caught something else, a switch on the wall. Against every horror movie instinct, Madison flipped it. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then blazed to life. She blinked in the sudden brightness, then stared in amazement. The room was even stranger, illuminated. The walls weren't just drywall, they were covered in diagrams, formulae, and what looked like star charts. Red string connected various points like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. A workspace occupied one corner, desk, chair, and filing cabinet, all in perfect condition. No dust anywhere. How was that possible in a cabin abandoned for 20 years? Madison approached the filing cabinet, locked. The desk drawers also locked. But atop the desk sat a leather journal, closed with an elastic band. Madison hesitated. This felt like trespassing in a way that exploring the decrepit cabin above hadn't. Someone had used this space recently. The lights worked. The air smelled fresh, not musty. But curiosity won. She opened the journal. The first page contained a single line in neat handwriting. For whoever finds this, you're ready now, or you wouldn't be here. Madison's hands trembled slightly as she turned the page. The next entry was dated 3 months ago, impossible if the property had been abandoned since 2001. But the ink looked fresh, the handwriting crisp. Project Convergence, day 2847. The mathematics are finally aligning. 8 years of calculations, of trial and error, of doubting my sanity, but the proof is here. The dimension barriers are thinner than we ever imagined. Not walls, but membranes. And membranes can be permeated with the right frequency. EW was right. This location is a natural convergence point. The cabin was built here deliberately, not for the view or isolation, but for what lies beneath. The iron deposits, the specific mineral composition, the underground water flow, it all creates a natural resonance. I've made contact 3 times now, brief but undeniable. They're trying to communicate, but our physics, our mathematics, our very concepts of reality are so different that translation remains nearly impossible. Like trying to explain color to someone born blind, but I'm close. So close. Madison sank into the desk chair, mind racing. Dimension barriers? Contact? This read like science fiction, but the technical diagrams covering the walls suggested someone with serious scientific training. She flipped through more pages. finding increasingly complex equations interspersed with journal entries that grew more excited and more unhinged. Day 2901 breakthrough. The frequency modulation worked. Not just contact, actual visual confirmation. They exist in a space parallel to ours, separated by the thinnest margin. Like looking through water, distorted but recognizable. They see us too, have been watching, waiting for someone to discover the method. The convergence point isn't just here. There are others, scattered across the globe. Ancient sites, mostly. Places where humans have always felt the thinness without understanding it. Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, the pyramids. But this one is unique. It's unopened, virgin, uncontaminated by centuries of human interference. Tomorrow, I attempt physical transfer. If my calculations are correct, the membrane can be crossed. Not permanently, the energy requirements would be massive, but briefly, long enough to prove everything. If something goes wrong, if I don't return, this journal stands as proof. The equipment is in the sub-basement. The activation sequence is hidden in the table drawer. Solving the lock puzzle will prove you have the capacity to understand what you've found. Trust the mathematics. Trust the convergence. Trust that you were brought here for a reason. David Chin. Madison's rational mind warred with the impossibility of what she was reading. Parallel dimensions? Convergence points? It sounded like the plot of a bad movie. But the technical sophistication of the diagrams, the mathematical proofs filling page after page, suggested someone with genuine expertise. She Googled David Chin physicist on her phone, finding several possibilities, but no one who'd gone missing 3 months ago. The table drawer beckoned. Madison examined the lock, not a standard padlock, but something custom-made. The keyhole was shaped like one of the geometric symbols etched on the table's surface. She studied the pattern, tracing it with her finger. It looked almost like a three-dimensional object, rendered in 2 dimensions. A hypercube, maybe? On impulse, she photographed the symbol and used a reverse image search. The results made her stomach lurch. The symbol appeared in papers on theoretical physics, specifically about higher-dimensional geometry. It was a projection of a 4-dimensional cube into 3-dimensional space. Madison spent the next hour trying to understand the locking mechanism. It wasn't just about having a key. It required manipulating the mechanism in a specific pattern that corresponded to rotating a hypercube through 4-dimensional space. The kind of puzzle that would stump most people, but that someone with the right mathematical background might solve. Her accounting work had given her strong mathematical skills, and she'd minored in physics before practicality drove her to a more stable career. Slowly, methodically, she worked through the rotations. Click, click, click. The drawer slid open. Inside lay a single sheet of paper with instructions and a small device that looked like a modified smartphone connected to a series of sensors. The instructions were precise: positioning, frequency settings, safety protocols. At the bottom, a warning in red ink. Do not attempt for more than 30 seconds. The energy drain is exponential. Extended exposure could be fatal. Madison should have left then, should have called the police or the FBI or someone who dealt with potentially dangerous abandoned experiments. Instead, she found herself following the instructions. She positioned the sensors according to the diagram. She input the frequency settings on the device. She stood in the exact spot marked with an X on the floor. Her finger hovered over the activation button. Once pressed, there would be no pretending this was normal, no returning to her spreadsheets and predictable life. But hadn't she bought this cabin seeking exactly that, something beyond the ordinary? She pressed the button. At first, nothing happened. Then the air began to shimmer, like heat waves off hot asphalt. The walls seemed to stretch and twist without actually moving. Madison felt a strange tugging sensation, as if gravity had suddenly shifted directions. The fluorescent lights flickered, dimmed, then blazed impossibly bright. And then she saw them. The room hadn't changed, but it was no longer empty. Translucent figures occupied the same space, existing in a slightly different phase of reality. They were humanoid, but wrong, too tall, too thin, with faces that hurt to look at directly. Not frightening, exactly, but operating on geometric principles that human eyes weren't meant to process. One figure seemed to notice her. It moved, flowed, might be a better word, closer. Madison felt paralyzed, unable to retreat or look away. The being raised what might have been an arm and touched the air between them. The barrier rippled like disturbed water. Information flooded Madison's mind. Not words or images, but pure concept. Raw knowledge downloading directly into her consciousness. the truth about reality's layered nature, the existence of infinite parallel spaces separated by membranes thinner than atoms. The purpose of convergence points as communication nodes between dimensions, the reason certain humans could perceive what others couldn't, and most importantly, why she had been drawn here. Her brain, like David Chen's, like E. Whitmore's before him, operated on frequencies that aligned with the convergence. They were natural translators, bridges between dimensions that had always existed but rarely touched. The 30 seconds felt like hours and microseconds simultaneously. When the device automatically shut off, Madison collapsed to her knees, gasping. The beings faded like after images, but the knowledge remained. She understood now why the cabin had called to her, why she'd felt compelled to buy it, why her life of spreadsheets and predictability had felt like a cage. She wasn't crazy, neither was David Chen, wherever he'd gone. The convergence point was real, and she was now its guardian. Over the following days, Madison returned to the cabin repeatedly. She read through David Chen's complete notes, finding additional journals hidden throughout the underground rooms. The space was larger than she'd initially realized, 3 connected chambers filled with equipment and research spanning decades. E. Whitmore had discovered the convergence in the 1,970 seconds. David Chen had found Whitmore's work and continued it. Now it was her turn. She learned to use the equipment more safely, limiting exposure and building up tolerance gradually. Each contact brought new information, new understanding. The beings she started thinking of them as the others weren't trying to invade or harm. They were explorers like humans, scientists in their own dimension who discovered Earth's convergence points and waited patiently for someone on this side to develop the technology to communicate. Madison began documenting her own discoveries, adding to the collection of journals. She took a leave of absence from work, then quit entirely when it became clear she couldn't return to her old life knowing what she now knew. Sarah thought she'd lost her mind, especially when Madison moved into the cabin permanently. The main structure needed extensive repairs, but Madison found she had help. The others couldn't physically cross over. The energy requirements were indeed prohibitive, but they could influence small things. Tools appeared where she needed them. Blueprints for repairs materialized on the desk. Problems solved themselves overnight. They were teaching her, guiding her, preparing her for something larger. What happens next will change not just Madison's life, but potentially the course of human history. The convergence point holds secrets that challenge everything we think we know about reality. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Winter arrived early in the mountains. Madison had managed basic repairs to make the cabin livable, patching the roof, replacing broken windows, installing a wood stove for heat. The underground laboratory ran on its own power source, something David Chen had installed that seemed to tap directly into the convergence point's energy. She still didn't fully understand how it worked, but the others were teaching her through their strange conceptual communication. She developed a routine. Mornings were for physical work on the cabin, afternoons for studying the accumulated research, evenings for contact sessions, carefully limited to prevent the disorientation that came with extended exposure. Each session revealed more about the nature of reality, how consciousness itself was the bridge between dimensions, how certain locations on Earth naturally thin the barriers, how humans had been unconsciously aware of these places throughout history, building monuments and temples at convergence points without understanding why. The others had a name for humans who could perceive the convergence: translators. Throughout history, they'd appeared randomly: shamans, mystics, scientists who glimpsed truth but lacked the framework to understand it. E. Whitmore had been one, David Chen another, now Madison. But something was changing. The contacts were becoming easier, requiring less energy. The barrier was thinning not just at the convergence point, but globally. Madison found references to this in the older journals, a cyclical phenomenon that occurred every few thousand years. The dimensions naturally drifted closer together before separating again, like a cosmic breathing pattern. The last convergence had occurred around 10,000 BCE, coinciding with humanity's sudden leap from hunter-gatherers to agricultural civilizations. The others had made contact then, sharing knowledge that sparked human development. Now another convergence approached, and humanity was finally technologically advanced enough to understand what was happening. Madison discovered she wasn't alone in this knowledge. David Chen's notes referenced a network of translators who'd found various convergence points worldwide. They communicated through encrypted channels, sharing discoveries and preparing for what they called the opening the moment, when the barrier would thin enough for true, sustained contact. One night in December, as snow fell heavily outside, Madison made a breakthrough. She'd been struggling with a particular equation in Chen's notes, something about frequency harmonics and consciousness resonance. Suddenly, it clicked. The mathematics weren't describing the convergence point, they were describing human consciousness itself. The ability to perceive other dimensions wasn't located in the brain, but in consciousness. And consciousness operated on frequencies that could be tuned like a radio. She modified the equipment based on this insight, adding biometric sensors that monitored her brainwaves during contact. The next session was revolutionary. Instead of the disorienting flood of information, communication became clear, almost conversational. The others had been waiting for this breakthrough, for a translator to discover the consciousness key. They showed her their world, a dimension where physics operated on different principles, where thought and reality were more closely linked, where their civilization had evolved along paths unimaginable to humans. They weren't more advanced, just different, and they viewed humanity with the same fascination humans felt for them. But they also shared a warning. The convergence wasn't just a natural phenomenon, it could be influenced, accelerated, or delayed. There were forces in both dimensions that opposed contact, entities that preferred the separation. In their dimension, these forces were contained, understood, but in ours, Madison woke one morning to find footprints in the snow leading to the cabin, fresh tracks, but no vehicle marks on the driveway. Someone had hiked in during the night. Nothing was disturbed, but a business card was tucked under the door. Department of Emergent Phenomena, Dr. Marcus Webb. She Googled the name and department, finding nothing. But that afternoon, a black SUV navigated the treacherous driveway with surprising ease. The man who emerged looked government dark suit, despite the rural setting, earpiece, professional bearing that screamed federal agent. "Miss Hayes, I'm Dr. Marcus Webb. We need to talk about your recent activities." Madison's hand moved instinctively toward the bear spray in her pocket. "I don't know what you mean. This is private property." Yes, property with some very interesting electromagnetic signatures that started appearing on our satellites 3 months ago, right around the time you took possession. His smile was cold. "May I come in?" She had no choice but to let him in, though she kept him in the main cabin area, away from the hidden entrance to the laboratory. Webb surveyed the repairs with apparent approval before turning his attention fully to her. "We know about the convergence points," he said without preamble. "We've known since the 1,940 seconds when the atomic tests accidentally revealed one in New Mexico. We know about E. Whitmore's work here, about David Chen's continuation of that work, and now about your involvement." Madison kept her expression neutral. "I bought this cabin as a fixer-upper. I don't know anything about—" "Please," Webb interrupted. "We have the energy readings. We know you've been activating Chen's equipment. What we don't know is how far you've progressed in making contact. Who is we, exactly?" A joint task force between multiple agencies, created specifically to monitor and control convergence point activity. We've successfully suppressed public knowledge for decades, but the approaching convergence makes that increasingly difficult. "Why suppress it?" Madison challenged. "People have a right to know." "Do they?" Webb's tone sharpened. "Imagine announcing that reality as we know it is just one layer of infinite dimensions, that beings from other planes of existence have been trying to communicate with us, that everything religions and science claim about the nature of existence is simultaneously true and incomplete. Society would collapse." He had a point, but Madison sensed deeper motivations. "Or you're afraid of losing control, of technologies and knowledge that can't be weaponized or monopolized." Webb's smile widened. "You're smart. Good. We need smart people. Here's the situation. The convergence is accelerating. Within 2 years, maybe less, the barrier will thin enough that contact will become undeniable. We can either manage this transition carefully or watch civilization tear itself apart. And you want to manage it. We want to control it. There's a difference. Management implies cooperation. Control ensures humanity's interests are protected." He leaned forward. "The others aren't the only entities in adjacent dimensions. Some are benevolent, like your contacts. Others aren't. We need translators who can distinguish between them, who can help us navigate what's coming." Madison recognized the recruitment pitch but also heard truth in his warnings. Chen's notes had hinted at hostile entities, dimensional predators that fed on consciousness itself. What exactly are you proposing? Work with us. Share your research. Help us prepare humanity for contact on our terms, not theirs. In exchange, you get resources, protection, and access to decades of classified research on convergence phenomena. And if I refuse, Webb's expression hardened. This property could be seized under eminent domain. Your activities could be classified as unlicensed experimental physics, potentially hazardous to public safety. Or, his tone shifted back to reasonable. You could simply disappear like David Chen. You know where Chen is? He attempted full physical transfer 4 months ago without proper preparation. He succeeded in crossing over but couldn't return. The energy requirements for return transfer are exponentially higher. He's trapped there, probably dead by now. Their atmosphere is toxic to unprotected humans. Madison felt sick. Chen's journal had shown increasing recklessness, driven by obsession. She'd assumed he'd simply left, not that he'd stranded himself in another dimension. Webb stood. I'll give you 48 hours to decide. Continue your research if you like, we're monitoring anyway. But consider this, the convergence is coming, whether we're ready or not. Would you rather humanity face it prepared or blindsided? After he left, Madison descended to the laboratory with shaking hands. She activated the communication equipment, needing to verify Webb's claims. The others responded immediately to her frequency, their presence now familiar, almost comforting. She projected questions about Chen, about hostile entities, about the accelerating convergence. The answers came in their typical flood of concepts and images. Yes, Chen had crossed over. Yes, he lived still, but was indeed trapped. The physics of return were more complex than he'd calculated. Yes, other entities existed, some dangerous to human consciousness. But the others showed her something else. Webb's organization wasn't just monitoring convergence points. They were actively experimenting, trying to weaponize dimensional travel to exploit the energy differential between dimensions. Their recklessness could damage the barriers permanently, creating uncontrolled rifts. Madison faced an impossible choice: work with Webb's organization and try to influence them from within, or remain independent and risk being silenced. But as she stood in the laboratory Chen had built, surrounded by the work of decades, she realized there might be a third option. The network of translators Chen had mentioned, they were still out there, working at other convergence points. If she could contact them, coordinate their efforts, perhaps they could prepare humanity for the convergence without government control or suppression. She spent the night encoding messages into the equipment's communication protocols. If other translators were monitoring dimensional frequencies, they'd detect her signal. It was a long shot, but better than surrendering to Webb or facing him alone. By dawn, responses started arriving, encrypted messages from locations worldwide. A professor in Tokyo who'd discovered a convergence point beneath an ancient temple, a teenager in Peru who'd stumbled onto one in mountain caves, a retired engineer in Scotland who'd been studying stone circle alignments for decades. Dozens of translators, all working independently, all reaching similar conclusions about the approaching convergence. They began sharing information, pooling resources. The government knew about some of them, but not all. Those still hidden could support those who'd been discovered. Together, they might survive the transition and help humanity adapt to a larger reality. Madison made her decision. When Webb returned, she agreed to cooperate partially. She'd share selected research, help train government translators, but maintain her independence. Webb wasn't happy, but recognized he needed her expertise more than he needed complete control. Over the following months, Madison balanced multiple roles: official consultant to Webb's organization, secret coordinator of the Independent Translator Network, and primary researcher at one of Earth's most active convergence points. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. Each day brought new discoveries, new challenges, new proof that reality was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone imagined. The cabin transformed from abandoned ruin to cutting-edge research facility. The main floor became a conference center where selected scientists received their first introduction to dimensional physics. The underground laboratory expanded, new rooms excavated to house additional equipment. The convergence point itself remained carefully protected, accessed only by trained translators who could handle the psychological stress of contact. Madison learned to navigate the political complexities of working with Webb while protecting the independent network. She fed his organization enough genuine insights to maintain credibility while ensuring the most critical discoveries remained hidden. The others approved of this deception. They dealt with similar controlling forces in their dimension and understood the necessity of gradual revelation. As winter gave way to spring, signs of the approaching convergence multiplied. Aurora displays appeared at latitudes where they shouldn't exist. Sensitive individuals worldwide reported strange dreams, visions of other realities bleeding through. The barrier was definitely thinning. Madison stood one evening on the cabin's repaired porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The scared accountant who'd impulsively bought this property seemed like a different person, a character from someone else's life. She'd found her purpose at this convergence point, discovered abilities she never knew she possessed. But greater challenges lay ahead. The opening was coming, and with it, humanity's next evolutionary leap or its greatest crisis. The translators would play a crucial role in determining which path civilization took. Madison gripped the porch railing, feeling the solid wood beneath her hands, grounding herself in physical reality while her consciousness reached toward dimensions beyond. Inside the cabin, equipment hummed with activity as another contact session began. The others were teaching her something new tonight, how to strengthen the barrier in places where hostile entities might break through, how to create protected spaces for when the convergence peaked. Earth needed defenses, and Madison was learning to build them. She thought of David Chin, trapped in another dimension, brilliant but reckless. She thought of E. Whitmore, whose initial discovery had started this chain of events. She thought of all the translators throughout history who'd glimpsed truth without fully understanding it. They'd all played their part in preparing for this moment. Now, it was her turn. The abandoned cabin she'd bought for $2,000 had become the center of a revolution in human understanding. What lay beneath the laboratory, the convergence point, the gateway between worlds would soon change everything. But first, humanity had to survive the transition, and that was far from certain. Summer arrived with unusual intensity. The convergence affected more than just dimensional barriers. Weather patterns grew erratic, electronics malfunctioned near active convergence points, and reports of strange phenomena increased despite government efforts at suppression. Madison coordinated with translators worldwide, tracking the acceleration and preparing contingencies. The independent network had grown to over 200 confirmed translators, with more discovering their abilities daily. They developed training protocols, safety procedures, and most importantly, methods for identifying hostile entities trying to breach the weakening barriers. Not all beings in adjacent dimensions wished humanity well. Webb's visits became more frequent and tense. His organization was fracturing between those who wanted to militarize dimensional travel and those who recognized the futility of trying to control cosmic forces. Madison carefully cultivated relationships with the latter faction, knowing she'd need allies when the situation inevitably deteriorated. "The president wants a demonstration," Webb announced during one visit, proof that this isn't elaborate fraud or mass delusion. They're talking about public disclosure, but only on their terms. Madison knew this moment would come. What kind of demonstration? Controlled contact, government witnesses, full documentation. Show them exactly what we're dealing with. He paused. "I've recommended you lead it. You have the most stable connection, the best control." It was both opportunity and trap. Succeeding would give her influence over how disclosure proceeded. Failing or succeeding too well could lead to panic, militarization, or worse. "I'll need full autonomy over the procedures," Madison negotiated. "My safety protocols, my choice of witnesses, non-negotiable." Webb agreed, having little choice. Other government translators had achieved only fragmentary contact, lacking Madison's natural affinity for the frequencies involved. The demonstration was scheduled for the summer solstice, when dimensional alignment would be optimal. Madison spent weeks preparing. She selected witnesses carefully, respected scientists, journalists known for integrity, religious leaders who could help frame contact in non-threatening terms. She worked with the others to design a contact protocol that would be impressive but not terrifying, informative but not overwhelming. The night before the demonstration, she dream visited David Chin. It wasn't a dream exactly, more a consciousness projection across dimensions, a skill the others had taught her. She found him in their dimension, alive, but changed. The alien atmosphere had forced adaptations, his body modified by their technology to survive. Madison? His mental voice carried wonder and warning. You found the frequency modulation. Good. But be careful tomorrow. The demonstration will attract attention from more than just humans. What do you mean? The hostile entities, they're drawn to large-scale breaches. Your demonstration will be like blood in dimensional waters. Have defenses ready. She woke with his warning, echoing in her mind. Quickly, she contacted the translator network, arranging for them to monitor and shield the demonstration remotely. If hostile entities tried to exploit the opening, they'd be ready. The demonstration took place in the underground laboratory, expanded now to accommodate 30 witnesses. Madison had installed multiple fail-safes, including an emergency shutdown that would sever connection instantly if needed. Webb stood among the observers, tension evident in his rigid posture. What you're about to witness, Madison began, is contact with intelligent beings from a parallel dimension. They exist in a reality with different physical laws, but share our curiosity about the universe. They've been trying to communicate with humanity for millennia. Today, you'll see proof that we are not alone in the multiverse. She activated the equipment, consciousness sliding into the familiar frequency. The air shimmered, reality bending as the barrier thinned. The others appeared, careful to manifest in forms that wouldn't traumatize human observers, geometrically beautiful rather than incomprehensibly alien. Gasps arose from the witnesses as the beings became visible. One other Madison recognized it as her primary contact approached the barrier. It projected concepts that Madison translated aloud: greetings, peaceful intentions, excitement at finally achieving clear communication. For 15 minutes, the demonstration proceeded perfectly. The others showed glimpses of their civilization, their technology based on consciousness manipulation rather than mechanical devices. They expressed desire for peaceful exchange, sharing knowledge that could solve Earth's energy crisis, cure diseases, expand human potential. Then Madison felt it a wrongness in the dimensional frequency, like a discordant note in otherwise harmonious music. Something else was pushing through, using the connection she'd established, the hostile entities Chen had warned about. Emergency shutdown, she commanded, but the hostile presence had already latched onto the open channel. Dark forms began seeping through the barrier, not the geometric beauty of the others, but writhing shadows that hurt to perceive. Several witnesses screamed. Madison drew on everything the others had taught her about dimensional defense. She visualized barriers of crystallized thought, walls of focused intention. The translator network responded to her mental call, adding their strength to hers. Together, they pushed back against the intrusion, but the hostiles were strong, fed by fear and chaos. One witness, a physicist who'd been skeptical, collapsed as a shadow thing touched his mind. Another ran for the exit, panicking. Webb drew his sidearm uselessly, bullets passing through dimensional entities without effect. Everyone remain calm, Madison shouted while maintaining her mental barriers. Fear feeds them. Focus on positive emotions, love, hope, curiosity. They can't tolerate those frequencies. It was asking the impossible of terrified people, but some responded. A Buddhist monk in the group began chanting, his calm radiating outward. The journalist who'd covered war zones controlled her breathing, forcing serenity. Others followed their example, and the emotional atmosphere shifted. The hostile entities recoiled from the positive frequencies. Madison seized the moment, channeling the group's combined focus into a pulse of pure intention. The shadows shrieked a sound felt rather than heard and retreated through the closing barrier. She slammed the connection shut, emergency protocols engaging. The laboratory's lights flickered and died, emergency power kicking in moments later. In the dim red glow, witnesses sat stunned, processing what they'd experienced. Is everyone all right? Madison checked the collapsed physicist, unconscious but breathing. Others reported headaches, nausea, but no serious injuries. The hostile contact had lasted less than 30 seconds but felt like hours. Webb approached her, face pale but determined. Those things, what were they? Entities from a dimension where consciousness evolved differently? Madison explained, exhausted from the mental effort. They feed on negative emotions, particularly fear and despair. The others have been warning us about them. They're drawn to unprotected breaches between dimensions. Can they break through on their own? Not yet, but as the convergence accelerates, the barriers weaken everywhere, if we're not prepared. She didn't need to finish. Everyone had felt the malevolent hunger of those entities. The demonstration changed everything. witnesses left with proof of both wonders and terrors awaiting humanity. Within days, carefully controlled information began appearing in mainstream media, not full disclosure, but preparation, seeding concepts that would make eventual revelation less shocking. Madison found herself at the center of a hurricane. Government factions fought over how to proceed. Scientists demanded access to convergence points. Religious leaders struggled to incorporate dimensional realities into theological frameworks. The public, sensing something momentous happening, grew restless with official vagueness. Through it all, Madison continued her work. The cabin became a training center for new translators, teaching them to distinguish between benevolent others and hostile entities. She developed dimensional defense techniques, consciousness-based shields that could protect against psychic intrusion. The translator network proved invaluable. They'd identified patterns in hostile entity behavior, learned their weaknesses. Like viruses, these entities needed hosts to fully manifest in our dimension, but humans with trained consciousness, anchored in positive frequencies, were immune to possession. Fall brought new urgency. The convergence was accelerating beyond all projections. Dimensional bleed-through events, multiplied objects appearing or disappearing, people experiencing spontaneous contact, reality itself becoming unreliable near weak points in the barrier. Madison stood in her laboratory one October evening, reviewing data from worldwide monitoring stations. The pattern was clear. Full convergence would occur within months, not years. Humanity had run out of preparation time. She thought of that night a year ago when she'd impulsively bought this cabin, seeking escape from her predictable life. She'd found so much more purpose, abilities she never imagined, connections spanning dimensions, but also responsibility for helping shepherd humanity through its greatest transition. The others contacted her as she pondered, their presence now as familiar as her own thoughts. They showed her visions of what successful convergence could bring, humanity taking its place in a vast multidimensional community, technologies that work through consciousness rather than crude matter manipulation. Art and science expanded beyond current imagination, but they also showed the alternative, hostile entities breaking through uncontrolled, feeding on human fear and suffering, turning Earth into a dimensional battlefield. The path humanity took depended on preparation, unity, and above all, conquering the fear of the unknown. Madison made a decision. Full disclosure couldn't wait for government committees and controlled releases. The translator network would begin preparing people directly, teaching dimensional defense to anyone who would learn. When the convergence peaked, humanity would be ready not because authorities decreed it, but because individuals chose to evolve. She sent the signal to translators worldwide. Operation Open Door was beginning. The abandoned cabin that had started her journey would become a beacon, teaching humanity to navigate the impossible realities approaching at light speed. The final phase was beginning. Everything Madison had learned, everything she'd sacrificed and discovered, led to this moment. The dimensional barriers were dissolving, and with them, every assumption about the nature of existence. But she wasn't afraid. The others were waiting to welcome humanity home to a larger universe, and Madison Hayes, former accountant turned dimensional translator, would help guide the way. Winter's arrival brought the convergence to a critical threshold. Reality had become negotiable near convergence points. Madison woke some mornings to find her cabin existing in multiple dimensions. Simultaneously, walls that were solid from one angle became transparent from another, rooms that connected impossibly, gravity that flowed in directions human physics couldn't explain. She'd adapted to the shifting nature of her environment, learning to navigate by consciousness rather than physical senses. Other translators reported similar adaptations. They were evolving, becoming something between human and other, bridges between dimensions. Webb's organization had fractured completely. Half wanted to weaponize the convergence, to establish human dominance over dimensional space. The other half, recognizing the futility of controlling cosmic forces, joined Madison's efforts at preparation and peaceful contact. Webb himself had vanished during an attempted forced breach of a convergence point. His fate unknown, but probably grim. The public could no longer be kept ignorant. Too many people had witnessed impossible events. Social media exploded with videos of dimensional phenomena, objects phasing in and out of existence, shadows moving against light sources, people claiming contact with otherworldly beings. Governments worldwide struggled to maintain order as reality itself became unreliable. Madison coordinated response efforts from her cabin turned command center. The translator network had grown to thousands, each teaching others how to maintain consciousness coherence during dimensional flux. They established safe zones around stable convergence points, areas where trained minds could maintain reality's integrity against chaotic influences. But hostile entities grew bolder as barriers weakened. They manifested in places of fear and suffering, war zones, hospitals, prisons, feeding on negative emotions and growing stronger. Several major cities experienced what media called psychic storms, mass hallucinations that were actually dimensional intrusions. Madison led a strike team of experienced translators to contain a particularly severe intrusion in Chicago. The entity had manifested in a psychiatric hospital, feeding on the patient's distress and growing to massive proportions. Traditional weapons proved useless. Only coordinated consciousness assault dozens of translators projecting focused intention managed to drive it back through the dimensional rift. The victory came at a cost. 3 translators lost coherence during the battle, their consciousness scattered across dimensions. Madison felt each loss personally. These were people she'd trained, minds she'd touched during shared dimensional experiences. Their sacrifice weighed heavily as she returned to the cabin. Sarah, her once skeptical friend, had become an unlikely ally. She'd experienced spontaneous contact during a meditation retreat and sought Madison's help understanding it. Now she managed logistics for the translator network, her organizational skills invaluable as they scaled operations globally. "We're getting reports from everywhere," Sarah told Madison during a strategy session. "The convergence will peak within weeks. Are we ready?" Madison stared at the dimensional maps covering her laboratory walls. Convergence points pulsed like a living network, energy flowing between them in patterns that resembled neural pathways. Earth itself was becoming conscious, awakening to its multidimensional nature. "We're as ready as we can be," she answered. 12,000 trained translators worldwide, safe zones established around major population centers. Defense protocols distributed to anyone willing to learn. But honestly, nobody's ready for what's coming. We're all improvising. As if to underscore her point, the cabin shuddered. Not a physical earthquake, but a dimensional one, reality rippling as another barrier weakened. Through the laboratory windows, Madison saw the forest outside existing in multiple states simultaneously. Winter pines coexisted with summer growth, autumn colors, spring blossoms, all occupying the same space in different phases. The others made contact, their urgency palpable. The convergence was accelerating beyond even their calculations. Something was driving it, pushing dimensions together faster than natural cycles would allow. They showed Madison images of vast entities moving through dimensional space beings that dwarfed both others and hostile entities, cosmic forces with incomprehensible agendas. The architects, her primary, other contact explained through concept bursts. They who shape dimensional structures, we thought them myth, but they wake. Your dimension's rapid evolution has drawn their attention. Madison felt a chill deeper than winter. If entities existed that could manipulate dimensional barriers themselves, humanity faced forces beyond any preparation. What do they want? Unknown. They acted last during our dimension's convergence millennia ago. Some dimensions they guided through transition. Others they restructured. Their criteria for decision remains mystery. She shared this revelation with the Translator Leadership Council during an emergency video conference. Faces from 6 continents registered shock and determination in equal measure. They'd prepared for contact with others, defended against hostile entities, but cosmic architects operating beyond comprehension, "We continue as planned," declared Dr. Kim, the physicist from Seoul who'd become Madison's co-coordinator. "Whether we face others, hostiles, or architects, our response remains the same: maintain consciousness coherence, protect population centers, and guide humanity through transition with minimal casualties." Agreement was unanimous if grim. They'd come too far to surrender to despair. The network mobilized for final preparations as signs pointed to imminent peak convergence. Madison spent her last normal evening walking the mountain paths around her cabin. The abandoned property she'd bought on impulse had become the epicenter of humanity's greatest transformation. Every tree, every stone held memories of discoveries made, abilities awakened, connections forged across impossible distances. She paused at an overlook where valleys stretched below, lights of small towns twinkling like terrestrial stars. Soon those lights would shine in multiple dimensions, visible to beings humanity couldn't yet imagine. The world would never be the same. Returning to the cabin, she found unexpected visitors. Jasper and his 2 children, the family who'd sold her the property. They stood nervously by their car, clearly affected by dimensional fluctuations, but maintaining composure. "Miss Hayes," Jasper began, "we've been following the news, piecing together what's happening. This place, we always knew it was special. Grandfather said strange things happened here, but we thought he was just old, confused." "He wasn't confused," Madison assured them. "He was perceiving what most couldn't. The gift runs in families sometimes. You might have the potential too." Jasper's teenage daughter stepped forward. "I've been having dreams. Other worlds, other beings. They feel more real than reality sometimes." Madison recognized the signs of emerging translator ability. She spent the next hour teaching the family basic consciousness defense techniques, ways to maintain stability as reality became fluid. They left with contact information for the nearest translator training center, another small victory in preparing humanity. That night, Madison didn't sleep. She sat in meditation. Consciousness expanded to monitor dimensional frequencies worldwide. Other translators joined her in mental space, a network of aware minds holding vigil as convergence approached its peak. At 3:17 a.m. Pacific time, it began. The first sign was silence, not absence of sound, but a deeper quiet, as if the universe held its breath. Then came the light, not from any single source, but emanating from space itself, dimensions bleeding through in cascades of color beyond human visual spectrum. Madison felt the barriers dissolve like morning mist. Her laboratory existed simultaneously in dozens of dimensions, each containing different versions of herself, making the same observations. The multiplication of consciousness was disorienting until she remembered her training, maintained core identity while acknowledging infinite variations. Across the planet, convergence points erupted into full activity. The careful preparations held mostly. Trained translators maintained safe zones where terrified populations could shelter, but in areas without protection, chaos reigned. Hostile entities poured through undefended breaches, and unprepared minds shattered under exposure to infinite realities. Madison coordinated global response from her cabin's multidimensional command center. She existed partially in each major safe zone, consciousness stretched thin but holding. The translator network performed magnificently, containing breaches and guiding evacuation efforts. Then the architects arrived. They manifested not as beings, but as forces that reorganized reality around them. Where they passed, dimensional laws rewrote themselves. Mountains became valleys, became oceans, became void. Time flowed backward and forward simultaneously. Consciousness itself bent under their presence. One architect focused on Earth, its attention like the gaze of a god. Madison felt it examining the planet's dimensional evolution, assessing humanity's response to convergence. The judgment would determine whether Earth remained viable or required. Restructuring. Drawing on every technique the others had taught her, Madison projected humanity's case directly to the architect. She showed their struggles and triumphs, their potential for growth, their unique position as natural translators between dimensions. She presented the network they'd built, proof that humanity could adapt without destroying itself or others. The architect's response came as pure concept that nearly shattered her expanded consciousness. Interesting. Potential recognized, trial period granted, not approval but not annihilation. Humanity had earned the chance to prove itself worthy of dimensional citizenship. The peak convergence lasted 7 hours that felt like centuries. When dimensional barriers finally began stabilizing into new configurations, Earth had fundamentally changed. Multiple dimensions now coexisted in the same space, accessible to those with training. Hostile entities remained a threat, but a manageable one with proper defenses. The others established permanent embassy zones for cultural exchange, and humanity began its next chapter as citizens of the multiverse. Madison collapsed in exhaustion as dawn broke over the mountains. But it was a different dawn. Suns from multiple dimensions painted the sky in impossible colors. The abandoned cabin she'd bought seeking simple change had become the birthplace of a new era. Sarah found her on the porch hours later, bringing coffee and a tablet showing global reports. Casualties were significant, but far lower than projected. The translator network had saved millions. Governments were reorganizing around new realities. Scientists rushed to understand physics that operated on consciousness rather than matter. "We did it," Sarah said simply. Humanity survived first contact with the infinite. Madison sipped her coffee, watching a flock of birds phase between dimensions as they flew. "We survived at the beginning. Now comes the hard part, learning to live in a multidimensional universe." But she smiled as she said it. The frightened accountant who'd bought this cabin no longer existed. In her place stood someone who'd help guide humanity through its greatest transition. The work ahead was immense, but so was the potential. From inside the cabin, communication equipment chimed with messages from others, from translators worldwide, from government officials seeking guidance. A new world needed building, and Madison Hayes' dimensional translator, humanity's bridge between worlds, would help design its foundation. The abandoned cabin's transformation was complete. What had been left to rot had become the center of a new age. And beneath its floors, where Madison had first discovered Chin's laboratory, the convergence point hummed with peaceful energy, doorway to infinite possibilities. She stood, ready to face whatever came next. The multiverse was vast, full of wonders and terrors humanity was only beginning to comprehend. But they would comprehend it, grow into it, become something greater than anyone had imagined. All because she'd bought an abandoned cabin for $2,000 and found impossible treasures hidden underneath. The story could end there, but endings in a multidimensional universe were really just new beginnings, viewed from different angles. Madison knew her journey was far from over. Earth's integration into the cosmic community would take generations. New challenges would arise: dimensional pirates, consciousness parasites, the politics of infinite realities. But humanity had proven itself adaptable. They would face each challenge as they'd face the convergence, with courage, creativity, and the unshakable bonds of consciousness that connected all thinking beings across all dimensions. The cabin stood ready for whatever came next, no longer abandoned but transformed into humanity's first embassy between worlds. And Madison Hayes, accidental purchaser turned dimensional pioneer, would be there to guide the way forward into an infinite future. The multiverse waited, vast and welcoming, for humanity to truly come home.